Great. Okay, I think we're ready to get started. I know we have quite a jam-packed program today, and it's great to have so many of you with us here for our 2022 Worldview webinar. So for those who haven't met me yet, I'm Jane Ann. I'm the CEO of Dóchas, and my colleague Niamh, who many of you will be familiar with, who is our key focal point for the Worldview programme, has joined us also on the line, as well as some other colleagues here from Dóchas. So as many of you know, obviously the Worldview programme is really about, identifying public attitudes towards aid and development here in Ireland. But I suppose it has that added dimension really around understanding why people think that way. And it gives, I think, a lot of our members very rich insight into, what will appeal most to individuals here in Ireland who indeed are very committed to supporting international development. And that's something that very much has come out of the surveys to date. Just to run through a little bit of the running order today. So we will have a presentation both from Behaviour and Attitudes. Firstly, just to go through some of the highlights from the research over the last year. And that will be followed by a presentation from Jennifer and David Hudson, who have been involved really in doing some of the message testing of some of those initial results and informing and working with BNA on that. And they will be able to provide some of their insights that they have developed over the past number of months. We will then enter into a question and answer session. So after each of kind of the main elements of the webinar today, we will have an opportunity for questions and answers. So you can either do that through putting up your hand, or indeed through sending a question in the chat box below. We'll have a very short break, if time allows, before we will be joined by Sally Hayden, who many of you may have heard of, who has just released her book. I think it's My Fourth Time We Drowned, and it's coming, I suppose it's getting a lot of critical acclaim at the moment, and I think many of us will know her as being a very credible and informative journalist, and we're really delighted to have her on board today. And there will be an opportunity to engage with Sally for questions and answers also. And then we'll be followed by reflections on the research by a number of our Dóchas members, primarily from Vikki in Goal, but also from Joanne in ActionAid. And these are two of the organisations who have really started to integrate some of the findings from the research already into their own campaigns, or indeed their strategy as well. So without further ado, I will hand over to Luke in Behaviour and Attitudes to begin his presentation. Thank you, Luke.
Thank you. So I will kick off. I think you can all see that there now. So thank you for Jane Ann for that lovely introduction. That sort of sets the scene very nicely. So what I'll do is I'll take you through the research findings for the next 15 minutes. And then I'll hand over to Jennifer and David to go through some of the communication aspects, and then we'll take some questions. So in terms of the study itself, it was an online quantitative survey. We interviewed over 2,000 adults age 18 plus nationwide, fully representative of the population, quota controlled in terms of gender, age, socioeconomic status, and region, ensure a very, very good spread according to the latest census statistics. We also interviewed just under 1,500 of the original 3,000 respondents from February, from the first study as well. And then we boosted that with an extra 500 of additional respondents this particular wave on that. And there was a new section on innovation or messaging, essentially, in this study, which Jennifer and David will take us through a little bit later on. The fieldwork for the most recent wave was undertaken the 20th of October to the 2nd of December. So that's for the fieldwork period that we undertook the most recent wave of research. So just in terms of the findings, what I thought was good if we had, first of all, a recap in terms of our segmentation, in terms of attitudes to, I suppose, overseas aids and development overall. So essentially, if you remember and recall, I suppose in the initial presentation, we had 6 segments that emerged. And there's a sort of 2 spectrums. One is the vertical axis, whereby the segments which are more near the top are more highly engaged, versus those which are less highly engaged with, I suppose, overseas aid overall at that. Yeah, and then we have another, the horizontal spectrum is those who are older versus those who are younger. And essentially, and there's a number of different other metrics that go into developing the segments. I suppose what comes through, I suppose, is a pecking order of 3, I suppose, for us, certainly segments which are of most interest to us in that. The first one is global citizens, which are highly engaged. There's about 17% of the population there, just over 600,000 individuals, and that. A little bit more of a skew towards males, a little bit more 20 to 39 years of age, a little bit more single, a little more middle class. They're more urbanites, a little bit more educated to the level of college and post-grad level. And they see aid as, I suppose, a humanitarian and moral imperative. So they see it as addressing, I suppose, exploitation by powerful countries, and administered more by multilateralists and aid organizations. So a very important segment in this whole sphere of that. The next one down, which we would also look at in terms of focusing in on, would be community activists. Yeah, they're about 9% of the population. There's over 342,000 individuals, and they're a little bit more single, young family. Yeah. College honors, sort of postgraduate, and again a little bit more middle class, a little bit more of a male skew coming through for those as well. And they sort of see aid as a basic human right and sense of shared humanity, and it's addressing, I suppose, a global economic system favoring rich countries. That's in terms of their angle, such on it and that. Then there's another segment, which again is of good interest for ourselves, and it's quite a large one, is 22% of the population. They're European multilateralists, yeah? Just over 800,000 people who fall into that segment. A little bit more female in terms of more Dublin and urbanite, a little bit older as well in that. And they look at aid for reasons of justice and morality. They see it best administered by Irish governments via, I suppose, aid organizations and overseen by multilateralists. And there's 3 other segments as well that fell out, which would be less, I suppose, engaged overall, so it'd be a little bit down in terms of the pecking order. National pragmatists, which would be about 15% of the population, certainly a little bit more blue collar, a little bit more rural and older. Empathetic reactionaries, which are like a quarter of the population, more female, about 25 to 44, again, a little more blue collar. And you have disengaged nationalists, which are about 10% of the population. And as you can imagine, they are the most disengaged of all, quite blue collar, quite male, and that, 25 to 44-year-old would be more skewed in that. The demographic profile of the segments overall are broadly on a par with what we were registered essentially in February of 22. And that in the size of them overall. So just to give a little bit of a flavour and a recap, we'll refer to them in the Remain report in terms of our total profiling of that. Just a couple of other interesting elements that came through in terms of the findings. First of all, looking at, I suppose, the general economy on the left-hand side, and also the financial situation of the household. And what we saw was people's perception of the general economic situation has vastly improved over the course of the year. So from February to December, when we did the most recent study on that, and there was the net better went up actually 10 percentage points in that intervening period on that, People, a little bit more skeptical about their own financial situation, with 28% believing it would be worse, yeah, and 23% believing it would be better, and about 46% saying it would still remain the same over the next 12 months and that, But then I suppose the negative gap had reduced here too, with, I suppose, people just being a bit more positive as we get into, as we start approaching, I suppose, the Christmas period of that. Obviously, since the research has happened, we've entered into a youth phase with an inflationary cycle and so forth. So confidence would probably have taken a little bit of a dent in the intervening time of that. But Irish people are still, having done other studies internationally, more positive, more positively disposed to the Irish economy than they are in other countries at this point in time. Just in terms of the top 3 most important factors facing Ireland, just to look at the differences from February to December, so as the year panned out, how did things change in that? Well, not surprisingly, it was COVID, I suppose, the coronavirus pandemic, that essentially subsided in terms of importance. Now, it still was very important for 39% of people, and so the top 3 issues in that, but it was dropped down from over 60% of that. So areas of housing, sustainability, those have increased in terms of importance. Yeah? And our segments such as community activists and global citizens significantly over-index on, I suppose, sustainability and climate change, whereas community activists, as not surprising, probably over-index a little bit more on the topic of homelessness. So a little bit of a change as we moved, and you'll see that through either pandemics, economic periods of challenge, and that people can become a change in terms of what's important, and it can be a little bit more insular in terms of issues as well, in terms of hard times. There's a strong sense as well that the pandemic has maybe focused people to become a little bit more inward looking. And this is a trend that was evident, it was evident before the pandemic, so they had issues around housing, homelessness, mental health. They were already higher on people's radars to begin with. But during the pandemic, we were very focused on ourselves and I suppose on the immediate issues that we were now facing as well. So initially the pandemic itself, but then how I suppose the health service in general was coping with it. And many people, they just don't have the bandwidth to cope with much more than getting through, I suppose, the crisis and that. So they actively were monitoring, I suppose, the content they were consuming. They were avoiding other bad news or skipping over distressing content. They were seeking out, I suppose, feel-good topics instead to distract themselves and that. And there's a degree of guilt about this, particularly amongst community activists and global citizens. But equally, they don't feel like they could have done anything else in the circumstances as well in that. So at that time of speaking to consumers, they were still in this mindset to some degree. Issues of personal concern. What was interesting, especially when we look at February to December as the year panned out. So climate and the environment increased in terms of importance, with, I suppose, global diseases, pandemics, and the economy still in the top 3, albeit they dropped back slightly. I suppose despite, climate change being the issue of the highest personal importance, areas such as education, healthcare, clean water, and hunger in developing countries actually became more important overall. So it actually increased in importance, and particularly in terms of to global citizens and community activists in terms of those particular segments and that. In terms of the top 3 main reasons, most important reasons to help those in developing countries, the top 3 reasons remained unchanged versus the previous wave. So it's all around human rights, shared humanity, and humanitarianism. They're the top 3. Incidents of being active in causes over the past 12 months. So how did that pan out? Well, I suppose the relativities between the causes people have been active in over the last 12 months are broadly similar to the last wave. But the level of activity the last 12 months has decreased compared to the previous wave. So what we're seeing is just a little bit less activity as the year panned out. And then when we looked at, I suppose, the greatest influences on views and opinions, what are the key issues on the key issues of the day? What are the areas or the channels that influence most? I suppose what we see is a slight drop in TV news and social media as being influencers on views and opinions of key issues, but they still remain within the top 3 most influential choices when you take out, I suppose, family members and friends. And then sources most frequently for news information. We still see TV up there, no change versus the last wave, But as the year progressed, we saw an increased reliance on newspapers, either traditional or online, and also in terms of radio as well. And we see it drop back slightly in terms of social media. The main causes of poverty in developing countries. So, these remain largely similar to what we saw in February, with, I suppose, government and private sector corruption in these countries. Then we have war and conflict, and government inefficiency and incompetence. They are the top three still perceived main causes of poverty in developing countries. And the extent the government should increase or decrease the amount of money it spends on overseas aid. So what we see is a net increase of 3 percentage points, wave on wave as the year progressed in that. And essentially basically a third feel that the government should increase a great deal or somewhat the amount of money it spends on overseas aid. And the Irish government should provide overseas aid metric. That metric remains really on a par with February 21, and you've 3/4 believing it as fairly or very important that the Irish government provides overseas aid. And also the level of agreement that overseas aid can actually help bring about positive change for those living in developing countries. You're basically 3/4 also agreeing with that this time around as well, that it can bring about positive change on that. And it's higher for females and a little bit more in terms of middle classes. Then just to look at what are the main and most important priorities for Irish government support and overseas aid. So in terms of the main priorities, the areas of health, education and water, they remain, I suppose, the top three priorities for people. But also we see here, as you can see, in terms of agriculture and also environment protection, having increased by 3 percentage points on the last wave as well, with economic growth sort of declining by 4 percentage points in that. So a little bit of those, again, that whole environmental element coming through, a little bit increasing in that, but still the top three are still the top three. Okay, so key takeouts then, before I hand over to Jennifer and David. So at a macroeconomic level, while confidence in the general economic recovery has improved since the beginning of last year, people's view of their household financial system still remains in negative territory, I suppose, confirming that the general public will still need to be convinced that personal donations or government support for overseas development aid is being put to demonstrably good use of that. And given, I suppose, how events have transpired over the last couple of months, I would say that's even more important. Key issues competing with overseas aid in terms of public expenditure include a perceived critical need to get the economy back on track post-COVID, addressing broader health service shortcomings, affordable housing for those who need it, and a desire to address ever-increasing concerns around climate change and sustainability. The great majority of individuals need to be reassured that the Irish government has a clear plan with this associated investment to address all of these issues first and foremost, if they're really convinced, I suppose, to support any increase in overseas aid spending in that. And obviously cost of living will play into that, and energy crisis at the moment as well. Regarding the potential to involve more people in activism around areas such as global poverty, reported levels of activism, they basically have declined quite significantly over the last 12 months. To some extent, some of this may be due to restraints on basically being able to participate in activities during, I suppose, 2021 lockdowns and that. If you remember, we're still actually in a lockdown mode this time last year on that. But qualitative research also, I suppose our qualitative elements of research also suggest that it is due at least in part to COVID fatigue and effect on people focusing on their media, financial and societal needs over and above, I suppose, broader, their own social needs over a broader societal concerns. None of this suggests that there's been a fundamental shift away from levels of concern with poverty in developing countries or the moral imperative to address such inadequacies at a human level. It simply means, I suppose, that us as agencies will need to work that a little bit harder over the coming 12 to 24 months to communicate its message to, I suppose, our messages to basically to all segments, particularly to global citizen and community activists and that. And indeed, when you question directly the percentage of Irish adults who actually would like to see an increase in Irish government overseas aid spending has actually increased between the surveys, and 3/4 will attest to the importance of the government providing such sort of aid. The most important perceived priorities that the Irish government should channel overseas aid towards, it's around health, education, access to water. They remain top of the wish list. Environmental protection is increasing in importance for certain segments as well. From a media planning perspective, TV still remains the most influential channel for audiences, but there is also evidence to suggest increased relevance of radio and indeed newspapers, either traditional or digital as well. And this might be a part return to traditional working patterns, also a bit of home working and a rejuvenation of, I suppose, the drive time radio slot as well. So I'll stop sharing and I'll hand over to Jennifer.
Great, thank you. Thanks very much, Luke. I'll hand over to you, Jennifer, to continue on that line there, if you'd like to go ahead.
Perfect, thank you very much. Can you see that okay?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Yes, but it's not full screen. There you go. Perfect.
There we go.
Yep.
Okay, so I'm going to kick us off and then hand over to David. As Luke said, the work that David and I are going to present is a kind of bit of innovation that we did in the Wave 2 panel this year. And what we wanted to do is really to try and test some messages and see what worked with the Irish public. And this is really against the backdrop of COVID, growing concern over climate change, and really a host of kind of domestic and international challenges. And so the question we were looking at is, how do we communicate development and aid in the landscape that we find ourselves in the autumn of last year? And so the approach here, we still worked with the same sample. So this is the exact same sample that Luke had just been referring to. But we tested a series of messages with them, 38 in total. And these messages came from many of Dóchas's partner organizations and were developed by the research team. We edited these messages for length and clarity and to remove any identifying information. So we didn't want respondents to see that it was from a particular organization and then to anchor their judgment about that message because they were warm or towards a particular organization. So all of these messages were anonymous and they were roughly about the same length. What we did was we showed the respondents 2 randomly selected messages or statements from this pool of 38. And the only restriction was that they couldn't obviously see the same message against each other. So we repeated this random draw of 2 messages 5 times, and then we pooled or aggregated all the results from those viewings and those rankings into the results that you'll see. And what we wanted to try and glean here was which message do people gravitate towards? And so the prompt that they were given was, please tell us which message you agree with more, the first or the second statement, either if neither is exactly right. So, you know, which one best reflects kind of how you think or what you agree with. And this is a really different approach than just a strict kind of A/B message test, where you've got a lot of control over the different words or phrases, or you're just kind of manipulating one part of the message to see what's moving the dial. This is putting a whole host of messages up against each other and then coming up with a league table to see what works best on balance. So David will talk a little bit more about the messages and how you can dig into them. I won't expect you to read that. That's just for information that when you get the deck and you can look at it on your own computer screen much closer, you'll be able to appreciate the variation there. But what I do want to say here is just a little bit on how to read the table. So essentially, if there are 2 messages, each one has a 50% kind of chance of being selected. So the messages that we deem to work better on average are those that scored above 50%, and those that those that work less well on average score below 50%. So the number that you see, the percentage in the column, is the percentage of time that message was chosen vis-a-vis any other message that was shown to the respondent. So it's that message against anything else that they may have come up against. So what worked well? Well, when you look at this, this particular table, this is just taking out the top 10 messages and kind of focusing our attention on what works really well here. The best performing message, chosen almost 74% of time, is that ensuring every child has access to education is the best investment in our future. That message, when it comes up against others, gets chosen nearly 3 out of 4 times. So it's really a message that works well across the sample and within and across different subgroups. And David will speak a little bit more about that. There are a couple of other themes, though, that emerge out of the different messages. The second message, ensuring basic human rights, is the best reason why we should help those in developing countries worse off than ourselves. If you scroll down a little bit and you look at to the second to the bottom message, our shared humanity is the best reason why we should help those in developing countries worse off than ourselves. There is what is coming out of the top performing messages, this collation around human rights, shared humanity. And that's not surprising given how well those justifications performed in the first wave about why people think we should give aid or support aid. So this is really picking up on some of those insights that we saw in the wave 1 data and kind of giving us a little bit of triangulation to say that talking about aid and giving aid as a means of addressing basic human rights and because of our shared humanity is working really well with the Irish public. I think the second thing that comes out of this top group of messages is around climate change. So you can look there kind of mid-table. Like COVID-19, climate change will disproportionately affect poor countries. But there's a nice nexus here between some of these big challenges, climate change, but also the pandemic, and the need to address those in a very interconnected way. So when we see these kind of big challenges, the public are very much able to recognize and support that solutions to big challenges must be linked and they must be addressed together. So just trying to then kind of pull out what we think the top insights around these messages. Basic messages, messages emphasizing access to the basics, education, health, clean water, sanitation, perform well with the Irish public, and they perform well across all subgroups. And that again also goes back to the point I think that Luke was making earlier. When you look at the areas for which aid people would like to see aid invested, education, health, clean water, sanitation, these are all kind of speaking and coalescing to the same point. Second, when we want to think about the values that are underpinning the messages that work really well, this is about basic human rights and shared humanity. So you can craft messages, by and large, that will land well across the board when you anchor them in these values. These are values that are universal. These are values that are widely shared across the Irish public and should give you a strong basis of support in crafting your message. And then finally, we note that 5 of those top 10 performing messages mention major global challenges, so COVID and climate change, very much with the emphasis on the need for global cooperation, that's hard to say, and linked solutions. So the public aren't looking at COVID as a separate and independent problem from climate. They recognize that these are global challenges that require global coordination. Okay, so what doesn't work well? I'm going to leave mid-table out here, and you can look at those kind of mid-table messages at your convenience. So what doesn't work well? the first one there, so Ireland's history of migration, I feel connected to those forced to flee their homelands due to crisis, conflict, famine, and extreme poverty. One hypothesis we went into wave one was very much around Irish identity and the extent to which the kind of Irish experience around famine and poverty could be a mechanism to kind of translate to the broader issue of development and the experience of people living in poor countries. We didn't see a lot of evidence for the identity hypothesis in wave one. We don't see a lot of evidence for it in wave two. So in terms of crafting messages and what works with the Irish public, linking it to this kind of shared sense of identity and a shared sense of experience isn't something that works particularly well across the board. The other thing that doesn't work well, and there's an important caveat here, are some of the more direct statements about overseas aid. If you're looking kind of mid-table there, overseas aid to developing countries strengthens Ireland's political influence in the world, chosen just under 35% of the time. Overseas aid is less than 1% of the budget and yields impressive returns on investment, chosen less than 3 in 10 times. So these very direct but instrumental characterizations of aid don't work well with the British public. And so kind of taking this in the round, as I've said, messages that focus on identity and solidarity perform less well, and they do challenge that hypothesis that we kind of entered this work into as a community, as a group, thinking that this might be a useful way to link the Irish experience with others. Messages about moral obligation and personal imperative to support aid also perform poorly. I didn't read it out in the previous message, but the next message down was this idea that Irish citizens have a moral obligation to support aid. And this is clearly not landing well across the board. So the takeaway here is don't individualize the obligation, avoid individual attribution, and speak as a collective, again, emphasizing that shared humanity and human rights. So we're all in this together because we have this kind of underpinning value of human dignity, and human rights works well. But individualizing that kind of responsibility or burden to help isn't something that we see working well for the broad Irish public. And then, as I was saying, there's very little evidence that these kind of instrumental arguments for aid are working well. So talking about aid in the context of Irish influence, increasing Ireland's influence in the world, increasing security, or enhancing Irish leadership doesn't work well with the public. They are very much driven by a kind of strong sense of values rather than instrumental motivation. The last caveat before I hand over to David is one of the messages that was on the bottom, at the bottom of the league table, says we should stop all overseas aid to other countries while we deal with coronavirus in Ireland. And we just want to flag here the reverse valence of this message or this statement. Because this is phrased in kind of a negative frame, what we see is that this message was only chosen 23% of the time. So people rejected this message. They said, actually, I disagree that we should stop giving aid to other countries because we have coronavirus in Ireland. So, so taking the inverse of that, 77% rejected this argument. And so this is one of the very specific aid arguments that we see work. And what it says to us is that when you hear other people making the claim that we've got problems in Ireland, we've got to deal with kind of challenges at home, the reality is that the majority, 3/4 of the Irish public reject this message, essentially the kind of charity begins at home thinking, and don't think we should stop aid. we still should give aid despite problems that we have in Ireland. And so I think that's a really important kind of caveat that organizations can use in defense against arguments that want to talk about home first sentiments and home first challenges. David.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to be super quick because I'm aware we've got a comment coming and some time for Q&A as well. And much of this is just to reinforce, I think, what Jennifer has already presented in the key findings. One thing that we've done is we've put all of the messages onto into a spreadsheet with those numbers, the overall ranking of the different statements. But also what we've done is that we've cut each of the statements by key kind of socio-demographics. And so you can take a look to see whether it matters in terms of whether somebody identifies as male or female and how the different statements go, their educational background, social grade, and so forth, religion, etc. And we find some actually really interesting and significant differences between these different groups. So well worth taking a look at, and we will circulate that after the workshop. Next slide, Jan. Okay, and here's just a screen grab of the spreadsheet, and just to give you an example, for Generation Z, so these are the people who have been who were born after 1996, they're much more positive on that statement. Immigrants and refugees contribute to develop the economy and enrich the culture of the country, which came 22nd overall, but actually comes their 5th for that age group. And they're also much less likely to agree that poverty is the consequence of war and conflict. Only 44% of Generation Z pick that statement, compared to 62% for the population overall. So what we're suggesting here is that the spreadsheet and taking a dig through it to look at the different statements will provide you with both, on the one hand, some useful information for micro-targeting, perhaps different groups that you're interested in or work with, or identify those messages that work across all groups. And again, like Jennifer was saying, that basic human rights are why we should help is one key message that does work across different groups. Next slide, please. There, I won't read this out. We will share the slides afterwards, but some of the key messages that that perform better than on average for those different groups. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, so the next thing that we did was that we went through all the messages and we coded them to see whether key themes or issues were in those messages. Then we could extrapolate and generalize away from just looking at the individual messages, but actually, do they reference Irish identity in some way? Do they reference health or education? Are they around global challenges or solidarity? And this allowed us then to model the results of those that were picked more frequently and see whether particular frames or themes were associated with those more successful statements, and to draw out these more general inferences. So the way of looking at this is how the messages were coded. The messages are ranked. The messages are like a vertical column there. And as we move from the left to the right, we go from the most successful to the least successful message. But then also, if the column has a blue dot in it, then it was coded as having that frame or theme in it. So if there's more blue dots to the left for a particular theme, they're associated with the high performing messages and vice versa. But we formally test this, as I said, with a model. Next slide, please. And this shows you the results of those different themes and the marginal effect. So as we move further to the right, if that theme was included in the statement, it increases the probability that that statement would have been chosen. So we see most strong effects, positive effects there for education of women and girls, and the strongest negative effects there for explicitly mentioning aid or migration. Next slide, please. And here are the numbers. So you can actually see that in concrete terms, that specifically referencing aid makes a statement 12% less likely to be chosen. Migration reduced likelihood of being chosen by 10%, COVID-19 by 4%, and this rational or kind of the benefits case for aid reduced the likelihood of a message being chosen by 4%. And then on the other hand, as you see there, a 23% boost for those messages that reference education, women and girls, 17%, climate change plus 9%, and human rights plus 9%. And finally, the moral case for aid. And I think just wanted to flag this up because Jennifer made the point that making it about individual responsibility or individual kind of moral case and duty is a bad thing to do, and I agree. But when the moral case is made for aid in the kind of collective sense that it's the right thing to do, then we see an uplift there. So that's it from me. Just wrap up and hand over and listen to the comment for both B&A and ourselves. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, David. I'll just to gather some initial thoughts before we open up the floor to questions and answers. I just would like to invite Owen Rice, who's the Communications Director with Irish Aid, just to share some of his reflections on the presentations there, as Irish Aid is obviously one of our key partners with regards to the programme. So Owen, would you like to say a few words?
Absolutely, thanks a lot, Jane-Ann, and I hope everyone can hear me. I'm in a very echoey room in Dublin Castle, so I hope the sound is coming through okay. Thanks very much for those presentations. They're absolutely fascinating. There's such a huge amount of data in there. You know, you could write a university thesis really on it, and you'd probably need a week or so to look through it all properly. But I just wanted to give, as Jenna said, some very brief, initial thoughts to it. And I suppose the worldview research for us, it's usually valuable in terms of providing that evidence base and tracking our collective impacts on public opinion. I think when you look at some of the headline positives that come out of that research, as I was listening to it, 77% of people think ODA is important. 1/3 wanted increased. A half wanted the same. 3 in 5 of the Irish public agree that citizens have a moral obligation to support overseas aid, and almost 80% believe aid works. So, I mean, they're hugely positive, and I think probably our counterparts in other countries will probably bite our hands off for some of those figures. And I think it probably confirms what we anecdotally knew, which was that the belief in aid in Ireland is quite wide, but it's also, I think, quite shallow. There's maybe the understanding of a lot of it isn't there, and that sort of wide but shallow belief is positive, but it is a risk as well, because it means that we can lose it. And indeed, as was referenced, the survey was taken at a time when confidence in the economy was on the up, and it would be interesting maybe to see has that taken a dip given recent events and current crises. I was struck by some of the COVID impacts, which I think probably make a lot of sense when you think about it. But I think it's interesting that, that idea of people moving back to traditional media, potentially due to some of the experience of social media throughout the COVID pandemic. Social dropped quite significantly in the most influential and bringing about social change category. Still the 4th highest, but it did drop by about 7%. But there's a real generational gap, which is really, really clear in that, for younger groups, it is far higher. And again, you'd expect that, but it's interesting to see the results spell that out. The percentage reading or watching reports about global poverty fell. Again, I don't think that's surprising, and I don't think it's a reflection of anything we as a sector are doing. I think that's just people potentially tuning out of some negative news during the pandemic. And again, the reported levels of activism decreasing probably isn't usually surprising either. There's a strong sense in the groups that the pandemic encouraged groups to become people to become more inward looking in the segments. So I think that's interesting when we look at the segments, and the segments are the bit that I find really, really interesting in all this. And they've stayed largely the same in terms of percentages, but that idea that people even within those segments are becoming a bit more inward looking, suggests that maybe it might be, you know, that little bit harder to kind of shift views within them. But I think the segments are the bit I'd highlight, I suppose, as the bit I'd really like to study a bit more. And it really asks us, you know, which segment do we focus on? And I think when I look at those, the global citizens are sort of the most receptive, and the disengaged nationalists are the least receptive. In some way, it's the in between 70% that I find the most interesting. The global citizens, obviously we can't take them for granted, but you know, they're sort of on board to a large degree. And I think the disengaged nationalists, I think you could argue, we'll probably never win them over. So we maybe just have to accept that there is that sort of 10% in the population that are just going to be that really hard to shift. But it's that 70% in the middle that is very interesting. And, you know, community activists, 91% are concerned about the developing world. That's even higher than global citizens. So I find that interesting. But I think, you know, the 6 segment groups, I think you could sort of roughly break them into 3, which is the committed globalists on one side, the committed nativists on the other, and then, as I said, that sort of 70% in the middle, who are very positively disposed to Ireland's global engagement, but I think they need that reinforced through evidence, impact, and greater understanding. And I think what it does to all of us is sort of challenges us to look at what's blocking them, and then how do we move them. So the sort of the blockers and the unlockers that each of them have, you know, and what motivates that middle ground. How can we deepen their interest and their belief? And my sort of initial reading of it is that the national pragmatists, which is 15% of the population, say they're primarily motivated by humanitarianism, which suggests impact is going to be the real thing that moves them along the track. The empathetic reactionaries, which is 26%, so a very large section of the population, charity and sympathy came through very high with them. So that would suggest that, you know, stories and emotion is how we sort of move them and get them to have that sort of greater belief. The European multilateralists, again, 22% of people, morality and justice came through quite strongly there. So sort of morals and rights, you know, that's a kind of an interesting one, and maybe a difficult one to decipher. And then the community activists, that sense of shared humanity seems to be what moves them. It's interesting, I think, that human rights, shared humanity, and humanitarianism were the top 3 motives for helping. But I think the need for impact and to I suppose shine a greater light on the impact of what we do is something that we're all aware of, and you know, I very much include Irish Aid in that. We need to become better at talking about the impact of what we do. You know, I think it's interesting that the most important priorities people called out for the Irish government were health, education, and water. So, you know, as
I think we might have
said in the presentation, it's sort of the basics, you know, of impact.
You're just breaking up on us there.
Only 53%, you know, so I think that clearly shows that there is a lack. Oh, sorry, is my
your reception is just going there, Owen. So sorry to interrupt you. You're kind of coming in and out. But we might open up the floor just to any questions and answers just at this stage before we move on to Sally, if that's okay. So as Owen mentioned, there's quite a significant amount of research there that I think you could spend quite a long time going through and disseminating and trying to identify different segments in order to target different groups with some messaging. But are there any questions at this stage with regards to, I suppose, the first half of this webinar today, but either for Luke and some of the research that's been carried out by Behaviour and Attitudes, or indeed for Jennifer and David from the Hudson group as well, that gave us some of those insights into key messages. So you can use the hand function the raise hand function in the reaction button, either to raise your hand, or indeed you could put a comment in the chat button as well, if you would like to ask anything. So is there no questions or comments from the floor? I suppose I just have one, and it might be a bit too kind of, you might not be able to answer this, Luke. It's really around, obviously the survey was completed in December, and, where there was a significant looking kind of inward, particularly with COVID, and the ability to kind of process the level of information of what's happening in terms of the scale of issues happening around the world. What are your reflections in terms of the reaction from Ukraine? Do you sense that is more of a kind of a temporary kind of growth spurt, let's say, or interest that will probably retract quite soon? Or what's your perception in terms of how the Irish public have engaged, I suppose, on an international issue over the last month or so?
Yeah, it's the €6 billion question. Yeah, how long will it last? It's undoubtedly flavored everybody's thinking at the moment, and I think a lot of people on this call are wondering as well. When a crisis happens, the one thing to say about the Irish public, they throw literally everything into it, and you can see literally the reaction and the donations that are going towards Ukraine at the moment are very, very high, and the media are jumping on onto it as well. So, undoubtedly, it's all attention is on Ukraine. And we did a recent poll, actually, with part of a Gallup as well, doing Gallup International doing a poll recently, and it was one of the number one concerns, that, and also inflation, obviously, and energy prices. So people are a little bit spooked at the moment. These things tend to go in waves. Heightened tension, plateau out. And really, how long? It depends on how long it lasts. The war. That's essentially it. That's the too fine a point in it. They'll tend to sort of simmer down after a while, level playing field, and then sometimes go off the radar, albeit it is on our back door. So I suspect it'll be sucking up attention for a number of months yet, I suspect, and then we're leading into a rebuild. The other side of it as well was we have inward migration as well of a scale which we've never encountered, and that requires thought, because we never had to house that many number of people. So there's a little bit of a sting in the tail probably there as well. That's likely to hit us a little bit further on down the line, So it's certainly coloured things at the moment.
Yeah, indeed, and kind of the correlation between kind of as it starts to impact the Irish public more directly, either like that through people arriving, or indeed, particularly when it comes to fuel or the economy and things like that, that you probably will see some correlation there in terms of the shifts. Great. Well, if we have no further questions, I might move on now to introduce Sally Hayden, who has joined us. Sally, as many of you may know, is a very renowned journalist, and I have to say, I came across Sally many years ago with my work with Médecins Sans Frontières, and I think from the outset I was quite, I suppose, enamored by the fact that she was very much a brave journalist and telling stories for the people, particularly in Libya and those crossing the Mediterranean. And it was very much, although there was quite a lot of media attention, particularly around 2015, 2016 on some of these key issues, I think she was very much one of the only journalists that was intent on ensuring that the voice of those who were suffering the most as a result of migration policies, and that the voice of those who were indeed trapped in detention centres was very much heard. And I think it was very powerful how she managed to convey a lot of the stories of that time, and indeed continues to today. And I think it's very, one thing I'll mention and why we invited Sally to speak today, apart from the fact that she does have a new book out, is that, you know, I suppose it's interesting for us as a sector to understand, I suppose, how, from her perspective, she tells extremely powerful stories. And it can be from everything from like that, in extreme crises or individuals who are experiencing extreme crises, but also in terms of telling stories about some of the everyday of how people are kind of engaging in everyday life in, where is it, in rural Africa or in other areas within Africa, and some of bringing the kind of normal everyday life stories to the fore, and really, you know, telling that personal testament as well. And I think it's also very interesting that in terms of her approach, not only, I suppose, just from a foreign correspondent perspective of kind of dipping in and dipping out, but very much embedded and engaged with the communities of those stories that she tells. And I think that we wanted to invite Sally, and I'm very curious to listen to her this afternoon, because I think it's very valuable insight that she can provide to many of our members within that kind of storytelling capacity of actually trying to, you know, break down perhaps some of the preconceived ideas that people may have with regards to not only aid, but also with regards to some of the causes of poverty, of conflict, of climate change, and how that's affecting people on the ground in some of the communities in which we work. So Sally, I think I'll hand over to you, and we will have question and answers after Sally's presentation, and please feel free to enter that into the chat box as well.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. You can hear me, right? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm grateful to be here. I didn't prepare a presentation like visually, so sorry in advance for that. I didn't know if I was meant to. But yeah, I thought that maybe I'd just talk a bit about how I work as requested, and a few of the approaches that I have to storytelling or to reporting. And then I'm happy to answer any questions or speak about anything as required, because the brief was like slightly broad. I think I should say first, obviously I'm a journalist, so I think my kind of reason for doing what I'm doing is different to you guys. So I'm not really measuring, you know, I'm not really going for the same sort of goals. Basically, it's just to report, it's just to explain what's happening in different places. I thought maybe the first thing, if I just speak through very briefly about my career and how it's happened, because that might be interesting for people in terms of how, I don't know, how haphazard this kind of work can be. I actually started off reporting through Irish Aid, very strangely, or reporting in Africa anyway, by getting a Simon Cumbers Media Fund award when I was a student. So when I was doing my master's, I won that, and the prize was to go to Malawi and to get mentored by the Irish Times. And that was actually the first time I wrote for the Irish Times. So very strangely, I've ended up working for the Irish Times through Irish Aid, which I'm obviously grateful for. And that was a good opportunity. I basically went to Malawi. I was meant to write about gender equality. It was my first time in Africa. I stayed for 6 weeks and did one story, which is like very unheard of, I found out, in journalism. And but just spent a lot of time just getting to know the country. I just spent time, you know, sitting in the market with the people who work there. Part of the award was, at the time, I don't know if it's still the same, you had to get a Twitter account and share things on social media. So that was when I started using Twitter, just to share updates from the trip. And then I kind of tweeted online that I was in Malawi, that I was an international journalist, which I wasn't really, but for the purposes of that trip I was, and started getting contacted by a load of different people, like a Malawian hip hop artist, a presidential candidate. And so that was my kind of first, I don't know, introduction into how to go into a country that you didn't know and start meeting people. And yeah, already I just tried to meet as many Malawians as possible. And I think that's kind of the way that I report now. I just try and meet as many people from the country as possible, from all different walks of life. I then worked for 2 years as a staff journalist with Vice News in London. So I was just doing general from the desk global coverage. You know, every day you have to do like 3 stories. It's very rushed. You don't really do so much depth on things. But yeah, that was good for building knowledge about different issues. And then since 2016, I've been freelance. So I'm sure, I don't know how many people know so much about freelancing, but you basically are kind of self-directed. So you're choosing what you're interested in. You're trying to sell those stories to editors. Often what you care about is not what they will care about. And so you have a lot of like just sending emails and nobody responding. But yeah, you also have a lot of freedom to choose what you think is important to a certain extent. And yeah, then 2019. So in that time, I've worked for pretty much everybody, including the Irish Times, RTE, and then everybody almost international. The Guardian, New York Times, CNN, BBC, a lot of others. I moved to Uganda in 2019, and since then I've been doing the Irish Times Africa coverage, and I'm on contract with the Irish Times just since November as the Africa correspondent. So as far as I know, I'm the only journalist for an Irish media outlet who's based in Africa, who's on contract. And that's obviously like, you know, not enough. Like, I think there needs to be a lot more coverage. So from some context, I mean, I've reported on a lot of different issues, but also you can't cover everything. And the Irish Times, like pretty much all the Irish outlets, they get the wire reports, you know, they have different means of getting news, but in terms of what I can cover, it does really, you know, they put a lot of trust in me to kind of decide what I think is important, but also I'm held back by being one person, you know, so you can't cover everything. So sometimes you just have to be selective, and that can depend basically on what access you can get or what original information you can get, or, you know, it's you know, it's not a perfect calculation, but you can't do everything. So I feel like it's good for us to take wire coverage that's well done and then do other things well, rather than trying to do everything badly, you know. So I was asked to explain how I engage the public and what challenges I have with getting through to the public and how I've overcome them. And I thought that was a flattering question, given that I don't know that I have overcome them. A lot of the time I do feel like with Africa coverage, I don't know, does anyone read it? So it's very much like you just do it anyway because you think it's important, but you don't necessarily know that there is an audience. I am lucky in that sense that the Irish Times, like, they're very supportive. They want to have good Africa coverage, and they aren't measuring, you know, how many people view my stories and things like that. I actually have no idea how many people read anything. And there would never be a decision made that I know based on how many people are going to read this. Should we prioritize this because it'll get more clicks or anything like that? I don't think they work like that, at least in terms of like the work that I do. I think rightly or wrongly in I don't know, in the Irish Times, we don't really tend to look for an Irish angle on the world pages. So we have in the Irish news pages, they'll maybe take an Africa story with an Irish angle, but for the world pages, we don't really do that. So I don't tend to go looking for Irish angles on different things. I just report what I think is important. And then I wrote here, sorry, again, the big challenge is that there just aren't enough journalists covering Africa. So that's something that I was quite conscious of when I took over the role. I've tried to do the best I can covering things, and I thought it was important as well. I thought it was going to be interesting to be focused on this, but yeah, it's a lot. So we try and get a balance with coverage humanitarian crises. Like last November, I was in Northeast Nigeria, where the insurgency with Boko Haram is still ongoing. You know, I'm due to go to Somalia, hopefully, like, to cover the drought. We have various other things going on that are in the pipeline, but we've also had you know, we're also making attempts basically to do other types of reporting, because we're kind of conscious that because of the lack of journalists based out of Africa, a lot of the news is being filtered through NGOs. So it's kind of like the NGO will issue a press release that then gets written up. And, you know, that's fine, obviously. But then there's also the issue that, you know, is that really painting a whole view of what the, you know, very complicated, large continent is like? And so one of the ideas we were brainstorming in Irish Times, one of the ideas was that I do a series, we've called it Young Africans Rising, which looks at young Africans growing industries, things that are going on across the continent. So I've traveled so far to 4 countries for that: Ghana, Gambia, Nigeria, and Kenya. And we've done stories about, not all of them have run yet, but about things like the video game industry, movie industries, in Ghana, the film industry, you know, interviewing young people. We interviewed the head of, or the winners of the Kenya Young Scientist competition, things like that. So we're running those stories in tandem with our coverage of broader crises and, you know, wars and all of the bad things that are happening. Then, yeah, like they said earlier, I've also been focused on refugee and migration related reporting for, I guess, like 7 years now. And in terms of that, I guess it's another interesting way at just looking how journalists choose what stories they cover. I mean, at this stage, I receive a lot of tips on things that are happening in that field because I've been reporting on it for so long and my reporting is quite well known. And for me, again, I try and look at how I can add value. So because I have a limited amount of time, I'm one person. It tends to be if I think that I can add information that isn't known to something, or there's a different angle that the public don't understand, which generally also comes from me realizing that I didn't understand something, or that, you know, I'm surprised when I get a tip about something, and then I think probably an audience would also be. So I look into that, or also, yeah, exactly, access, like I said. If I get offered a good interview, somebody that I hadn't imagined would speak to me, or someone that's like on the ground witnessing something themselves, that would make me more likely to cover a story. I have 2 examples of stories that I've covered about migration. One was a story in 2017, an investigation looking at Syrians returning home. So this was a tip-off that I got actually from a Syrian journalist who had come to Europe as a refugee. And he said that a lot of Syrian refugees were trying to return back to Syria, which I didn't know about, and that they, some of them were disappearing upon return. So for me, that was an example of a story where I thought, you know, actually there's all the coverage at the time was about Syrians coming to Europe, and the narrative was like Syrians all want to come to Europe. And this idea that there were actually large numbers who were trying to go back, but then were getting in trouble, I thought was something that would challenge kind of public understanding, because it challenged my understanding. And also that, you know, it seemed important to shed light on. So we looked into that, we did a big investigation, and it turned out that I ended up being able to go to Syria and met a man who had been arrested and detained after arriving at the airport, and tortured and then sent to the front lines to fight against ISIS. And then I came over across more testimonies of similar things happening. And we released that investigation, which got a big reaction, because I think it challenged preconceptions, you know, like for me, it had challenged them. And also it shed light on kind of a new issue. And also it answered a question that I think a lot of people were asking, you know, why won't they go home? Why do they want to come to Europe? You know, what's going to happen in the future? When will we send them back? You know, people were starting to talk about Syria being safe at the time. And so I think also if you can look at the questions that people are asking and you have a story that answers them, that can be useful. The second one that I was going to mention was the one that my book is about, migrant detention centers in Libya. And this was kind of accidental for me. I got contacted in 2018 by a refugee who was locked in a Libyan migrant detention center. And I had known a bit about people traveling through Libya. I'm sure everybody here knows, but people travel through Libya across the central Mediterranean Sea to try and get to Europe. And since 2017, the EU has been supporting the Libyan Coast Guard, which effectively intercepts people and they get forced back to indefinite detention. And I got contacted by a refugee in a migrant detention center. And basically, because I hadn't even known so much about it and I was trying to get help for these people, I started posting the messages on Twitter, and they ended up getting viewed. It became a thread and they got viewed like millions of times at this stage. And that story, I think probably because of my naivety, that meant that I actually appeared like I was shocked as well, because I was, ended up getting a lot of attention, and a lot of people who hadn't known about what was happening became like involved in what was happening and started speaking about it. And I mentioned that as an example of, you know, I was asked about engagement. That was kind of accidental engagement from my part, but I think from some aspects, like, of course, you're a journalist, you try to be objective, and you remain objective, but also when something is surprising or shocking to you, it tends to be that like gets conveyed to an audience, if that makes sense. And so, yeah, I was asked to speak about my approach to storytelling. I mean, I try to speak as much as possible to people who are directly affected by something. I try to look for the voices that aren't being heard, or the voices that, you know, might be being silenced or just being ignored. And yeah, I have to be also very careful, because a lot of the people I interview, they have been traumatized or they are quite vulnerable. And so again, you have to, you know, you take that on a case by case basis, but that will depend how you tell the story as well. And, you know, sometimes that's surprising. I mean, I was asked, what are the differences between how your editors want a story told and how a person that you interview wants a story told? I tend to think if someone's quite vulnerable, you can ask them how they think their story should be framed, or, you know, you try to give them a certain amount of dignity. Obviously, you don't lie or anything, but you will say like, well, how would you explain this thing that happened to you, or what do you want to come from this, you know, come from you telling me about this. And you have to listen to that. You don't always have to do it, of course, but like you have to listen to that and understand why they are telling it. And respect, of course, if they don't want it to be, you know, if they don't want to be named or they don't want to be identified or anything like that. And then you go to your editors, and I'm lucky with my editors. They tend to be quite supportive of what I think, but yeah, that can depend working on with different people, but yeah, anyway, I don't know. So I don't know if I fully answered all the questions, but I'm happy to answer any questions as well.
No, that's great. No, thanks very much, Sally. And like that, anyone feel free to ask a question. You can just put up your hand. But I think what's really a couple of things that I just picked up on is just what you mentioned there around kind of trying to draw a line between the questions that people are asking, you know, as in like if the Irish Public Chronicle, what is actually going on there? Why are people doing this or not that, you know, and trying to, perhaps it's probably something also for many of our members or NGOs as well, to kind of actually ensure that they're kind of looking at what some of those questions are and trying to actually kind of tailor, I suppose, not even the messaging, but tailor kind of the response or what we're talking about or what we're, you know, releasing a press release about or commenting on, that actually reflects perhaps some of what the questions are, that changes very frequently within the Irish public, but just kind of following that trend. I'll just pass over to, I have a question there from Paul Donoghue. Do you want to go ahead, Paul, and just introduce maybe where you're from, if that's okay?
Hi, Sally. Yeah, so Paul Donoghue, the head of media and communications at Christian Aid Ireland. Sally, it was really interesting hearing everything you just described. And I'd like two questions, really. Great to get your thoughts on. One is, I guess, do you have any insights on when you've been dealing with NGOs in ways that sometimes we get it wrong on how we try and interest journalists, and is it always interesting when a journalist has to remind us they pitch to their editors too? But, you know, when we're trying to communicate with journalists, the best way that we can influence you to take up a story. And then secondly, I don't know if you ever really pay much attention to the kind of stories we tell ourselves to our supporters. And right at the start, you said you do have different targets. And I think that's an important kind of point to make. But if you have any thoughts or reflections on our own storytelling especially if you've got any recommendations or suggestions on how we can improve it. I think that'd be great to hear. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. I answer first. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Do you want to go ahead with that? Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I mean, NGOs, the biggest problem that I have I work a lot with NGOs to get access. So people will say, do you want to come and interview people in this situation? We can help you do that, as Paul has actually done for me in the past. And yeah, the biggest problem is just not showing what the problem is. Like, that's always something that I have with NGOs. It's fine if you show me, it's one thing if you show me, these are people we have helped and they will tell you how great we are and we have helped them. But if I don't see the bigger problem, then it's very hard for me to report on that, because I don't have something to contrast it to, and as a journalist, you're not just a comms person for an NGO, you need to actually be able to show what the issue is. And yeah, that's something that I've had to explain to people quite carefully, and it's hard because it's not like you don't trust them, but at the same stage, my story can't just be this one person got helped in this crisis of 2 million people or whatever, and isn't that great. I have to be able to speak to someone ideally who is affected at the time by the thing. And yeah, I don't know if that makes sense, but that's been something that I've had. And then in terms of the stories NGOs tell, obviously it's totally different depending on the NGO. I think different people have different approaches. I don't know. I think that's why I think the job is kind of different, isn't it? Because for us, we need to make sure that there's a lot of context there. And I have seen it where, for example, in Uganda during coronavirus, there was kind of like an oversimplification of what was happening, and there wasn't enough explanation being given as to the role of the government. For example, I remember there was one boy who died because the government basically banned all transport and didn't make any exception for emergency medical care. And so this boy couldn't get to the hospital. And then a certain NGO, an Irish one, actually was then saying this boy died because of the coronavirus pandemic. And it was like, well, it's not that simple. It's actually the government has banned emergency healthcare because they've just implemented this kind of nonsensical law without thinking of the people who could be affected. And so it was actually a political issue slightly more than just saying, if you send money to our NGO, then we will be able to help people from dying, because actually the NGOs at that time couldn't even operate properly because of this transport ban. But yeah, I don't know that I'm the right person to answer that more generally, because I know the roles are kind of different and my job isn't really, raising money. So
yeah, but I think there is that tension. I think it links back a little bit to what came out, I think, of some of the messaging and the worldview, even results, is kind of like there's broad level support, but sometimes it isn't so deep. And I think sometimes that's the challenge, I think, for some of our members and some of the NGOs is, okay, at what stage do you get into that more kind of complex messaging? And, how does that, how can you show a true view of what's happening, but at the same time not overly complicate it, so it kind of gets lost, or the NGO gets lost somewhere in the middle. But I might go to Colin.
Maybe it's worth me also just saying, that's one thing that I've noticed, particularly with migration reporting. If you just do a story about like someone, with a tragic past who then has become a refugee, and you run that story, I've noticed that people, like readers, are very skeptical about that. They tend to think you're trying to pull at their heartstrings or something, and you're not giving them the full context. And then this is just my judging by what people say online and everything, or even what people I speak to say, but like they tend to feel that you're trying to use them. And so for me, when I do migration reporting, for example, I try and put in nuance, I try and put in context, because I'm aware that if I just have that one sad story, but that might be different for NGO work, but for me, I know that I can't just have one sad story. I need to have the context around it and explain why something has happened, and also like address like questions that the reader might have, because otherwise they become skeptical and they stop trusting you. They think that you're biased or you're, not objective and you're pushing some narrative.
Yeah, exactly. Colin, do you want to go ahead? Colin Lee?
Yeah, thanks. Colin Lee, Self-Help Africa. Sally, thanks for that Just very briefly, a sort of question, if you like, on Frontex. We're aware of sort of rapid growth, probably the largest growth within the EU agencies, but now, as you pointed out recently, operating off the West African coast, substantial sort of operations off Libya for the last few years as well. It's a fine line, I think, for NGOs very often to, push Brussels on funding and different elements, and yet Frontex have their own mandate. Just be interested to hear, I know you've been quite outspoken about them in the past as well. Just be interested to hear briefly your views. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, they're not, from what I know, they're not operating off West Africa, but they've offered to, but it's on the basis of Senegal agreeing, which I don't think they have right now. I don't know about NGOs taking money directly from Frontex, but yeah, I mean, for me, I've reported on Frontex only mainly in the context of the Central Mediterranean, and I know that they are involved in surveillance and are rapidly expanding and have also been accused of kind of gross violations of human rights in the Eastern Mediterranean. And I think, I don't know, for me, I'm a journalist, we're trying to report on what they're doing. I don't know that I interviewed them for my book, for example. They say that they are involved in these Libyan Coast Guard interceptions. They do the surveillance to and then pass that information on, but that they're not responsible for anything that happens once people get returned to Libya. So for me, there's limits to the sort of observation that they're doing. And as journalists, we need to watch them, but it's a huge organization and a huge operation. So that's tricky. But I don't know, as NGOs, I mean, I don't know how the NGOs and them deal with each other.
Yeah, I'm aware of some programs that are funded, particularly in West Africa at the moment, by the EU, under a sort of livelihoods term, that it's more to kind of stop that route out of West Africa and to the Canary Islands and places. So it was more the sort of challenge that I think NGOs have with Brussels centrally to, when we have an EU agency like Frontex, prevent, obviously there are breaches on occasions of human rights, and just weighing that up, I think, for all of us can be complex sometimes. Thanks.
I mean, I don't know, my book looks at that actually, but that EU funding, I think you're talking about the EU Trust Fund, which is slightly separate to Frontex, but there's a lot of issues around that, and I don't know, I think different NGOs have taken different stances. I know MSF won't accept that money. They say that it's morally wrong to accept it, whereas I think most others are taking it.
I just want to join in. Anna there put up her hand, Anna Sporinska, if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yes, thank you very much. That's exactly how you pronounce it. Thank you so much. I work in global citizenship for Go Global, and I was just wondering, based off Paul's question, especially Sally's answer, just made me realize what you're saying about the audience maybe being a bit tired or feeling manipulated when you use tragic stories. Have you as a journalist, have you noticed that positive, inspiring stories that empower our beneficiaries? Have you noticed that there's a more positive reaction, or how easy, I guess, are those stories to sell? You mentioned being a freelancer to the media. I know traditionally there's always this almost obsession with clickbait and something tragic and this monopolization of sad stories in the media. Is that something that's real, or is there a potential, I guess, what I'm trying to ask, in telling more positive stories without losing the audience belief that we still need to be there and help?
I mean, I think, again, I'd say that our roles are slightly different, but like I said, in the Irish Times, we are quite conscious that we don't want all of our coverage of Africa. I mean, Africa has 1.4 billion people, right? 54 countries. We don't want all the coverage to be filtered through NGOs, or also to be centering white people, for example. And we don't want it all to be negative. And so that's been something that I have been trying to like just think about in my own coverage. And that's partially why we're currently running a series that looks at, you know, the film industry in Ghana or the music industry in Nigeria, or, you know, I just spent time with a trans artist who runs an artist residency in Ghana. Like, we have all these stories coming that are not negative, but at the same stage we don't think of it like it's inspiring or positive on purpose. It's just like looking at a different part of life than, you know, something that's just terrible. Because I think for me as well, I mean, everyone working as a foreign correspondent, I think in Africa, thinks about this, that you also have to wonder what kind of long-term damage is it doing when every story that comes out of a continent is negative, you know. And I have African friends who will go, I go to Ireland and everyone thinks that I'm, you know, a famine, I'm just escaped a famine, or I live in attached, you know, a hut, or we don't have cars in my country. And in terms of long-term damage, I'm sure that, you know, even just doing trade, like Africans trying to do trade or get visas, or all of these things isn't that being impacted by the fact that maybe there are these preconceptions about how they function or how their countries are. And so we're just trying to get a balance. But I also am anti this kind of, you have to have just a positive story. You know, I think you have to be very careful about saying something is only positive, because that can go very wrong for you. You can be proven wrong quite easily, but you can show the nuances, but just look for different angles. But again, I don't know, like the NGO fundraising thing is slightly different because I'm not trying to raise any money. So
no, thanks for that, Sally. And I know that you'll have to go shortly. There's one question there from David. I'm hoping we might be able to squeeze in. David, if you can ask a very quick question to Sally before she has to run off.
Quick. I think this relates to the data that was shown by Ian, and then Owen picked up on, thinking about the kind of the segments, the bits of the population that we need to kind of change their minds. And I was wondering, from your experience as a journalist, whether you had any pointers about ways of telling stories that help skeptical people to change their minds, or indeed makes them kind of even firmer at holding their skeptical opinions. Any pointers for us?
I mean, I think you can just address an issue head on. Again, journalism is a bit different to comms because we're just trying to show things as they are. But at the same stage, I think a reader can tell if you're avoiding a certain issue. I think if you tackle something head on, like for me, when we did the Syria investigation, it was like, at the time, the thinking was we shouldn't challenge, you know, people who wanted refugees to be supported were saying, you know, you're kind of talking about a far right narrative to say, should, like, people are going home. Even highlighting that people were returning home was seen as like, you might be pushing an agenda that they should go home. And for me, I try not to think about the consequences of my reporting, because I don't think that you can predict those. And I think you can only tell the truth and, you know, show what is happening. But at the time there was a backlash about, like, I even went to Syria and I spoke to authorities there. I said, I want to show what happens when Syrians return home. And what we uncovered was that people were being arrested and tortured and all these kind of horrific abuses. But that topic was seen as pushing, kind of as being like a far right topic, that a lot of journalists that I know who report on human rights would have been like, I don't want to touch that because that's, I don't know, seen as pushing a kind of far right agenda or something. But actually, I think if you tackle a question head on and say, well, what will happen if they go home? And then you show what will happen, that's more likely. I don't know that change mind is right, because I didn't set out to change minds, but I think that someone will actually respect that a lot more than if you kind of look like you're avoiding asking this question. I don't know if that fully answers, but I just think you can't fully ignore what someone is raising as their argument. I mean, it's not for you to have to tackle every argument. Some arguments are just like racist, you know, but at the same stage, you can say, well, why are they saying this? And maybe address that question. But I don't know, I'm not a comms person, but in journalism, I think that's useful.
Yeah. Thanks very much for that, Sally. I know you have to go, so I really appreciate your time this afternoon, and I'm sure many of our members do as well, who've joined us on that call. It kind of gave us good insight, particularly from your own journalistic perspective, but I think there are definitely some kind of tips there for us to try to take on board going forward as well. So I appreciate that. And best of luck with all the book launch and everything.
Yeah, thank you guys so much.
Great, thank you. Well, thanks everybody. I know that was short, but I think we were, Sally had some other pressing commitments, but we do have our last segment for the webinar today, where we're going to be joined both by Vicky Walsh in Goal, and then by Joanne Ward in ActionAid Ireland. And I know that, you know, for Goal, they've already started a campaign that has taken on some of the insights and some of the data from the Worldview program. So they'll describe a little bit of their approach to date and some of their own findings. And then we'll be followed by Joanne, who is definitely incorporated, or ActionAid is definitely incorporated, I think, some of the broader kind of worldview objectives in their new strategy. So would you like to go ahead, Vicky?
Great, thanks, Jane-Ann, and hi everyone. Good to see the Worldview community again this year. And yeah, just to introduce myself, I'm Vicky Walsh. I'm the Global Citizenship Manager with Goal Global. We cover public engagement, global citizenship education, which is formerly development education, and influencing. So yeah, first off to say thank you to Dóchas for the invite and for leading on this incredible work and research, and to the Department of Foreign Affairs and all of today's presenters. It was great to get an insight from B&A and the Hudsons and from Sally. And just great to see the progression of the project. I suppose we're in year 2 now, and to see the benefits coming from it and how it's evolving. Found the results really encouraging, and the message testing in terms of innovation was a great add-on. So I'm really looking forward to see how we can delve deeper into the research year on year. I suppose the findings themselves are very encouraging to see that that broad support is still there and it's still high. And the importance of issues like global health, education, water and sanitation are still, you know, important in the minds of the Irish public. I suppose slightly discouraging to see the decrease in activism and engagement among the Irish public, but not surprising given the context of the last 2 years. So as Luke said, it's kind of giving us as the sector further motivation to find and create new and creative ways to engage with the Irish public. So I think a surefire way to do this is to meet the public where they're at, and to reach them with messages that resonate deeply with them. So that's where the Worldview research comes in really strongly, as really supporting us as members to do exactly that. So I'll talk a little bit about how we've used it in Goal Global. So kind of broadly, it's been really useful tool in terms of our strategy development for the next 5 years and our programmatic design for the next 5 years, in terms of giving us that baseline, in terms of targeting and channeling messages. So that's been really, really helpful, and kind of will serve as a good tool for the next 5 years in terms of making sure that we're on track with our campaigning. So I'll give you an example then of a specific campaign that we've run in Go using the research. So it was our public engagement campaign last year called #ConnectedTo. So it was a purely digital campaign given the year that was in it. There was no events happening, so we kind of strategized to use the Worldview research to inform an online outreach campaign. And specifically with a focus last year on climate change and food systems. So that was ahead of COP26 and the UN Food System Summit. And you know, they were kind of priorities in the international agenda and within goals. So we wanted to essentially raise awareness of these issues among the Irish public, but specifically through a global citizenship lens. So you know, creating that sense of interconnectedness, systems interrogation, and motivation for collective action. among an individual responsibility tied with collective action among the Irish public. So we kind of looked at the research which came out just around the same time we were designing the campaign. So that was to consider the strong focus on the human connection and the interconnection. So as Luke kind of presented earlier, we've seen the top three value drivers among the Irish people are that shared humanity, human rights and humanitarianism, as opposed to maybe more traditional and outdated drivers of pity and sympathy. So I think in that, human is the common denominator there. So we developed a campaign that really kind of targeted the human element of the work we do on the kind of the larger global issues, but kind of bringing it back to that human level and how it affects people. And doing that, we wanted to create a sense of connection and deepened empathy between Irish people and then the communities we work with overseas and the issues affecting their daily lives. So in doing that, our primary target audiences were identified by the research again. So we look to target the global citizens who are, you know, at the top of the engagement scale, community activists and the empathetic reactionaries. So a bit like Owen had mentioned, you know, we were more interested in that middle cohort, or the movable middle. And we targeted them with a nudge up strategy, which essentially was with the aim of moving each segment up, further up on the scale of engagement and support. So we used a few tactics to do that, using that kind of connection, shared humanity concept as the basis for it. So one example is the In Conversation with Connection series that we developed. So essentially we linked change makers, young change makers here in Ireland, working in climate sustainability and food systems with young change makers in the countries we work in, predominantly in Africa and Central America. So we kind of recorded and filmed these essentially Zoom conversations that were happening during COVID, really, with them, and as highlighting the interconnection of the actions that each change maker was taking in pursuit of a common goal. And just really interesting, and encourage you to watch those conversations and just see how that connection and how they're finding the connections between their work, and how you can actually see the relationships and the empathy growing within that conversation. So we hoped that that type of feeling was then, you know, passed on to the viewer that we engaged with through the campaign. So that was a really effective tool. And then another one that we've just launched actually was produced by our global Next Gen Youth Programme. So each year we have a youth programme that brings together 15 Irish or young people in Ireland, not necessarily Irish, with 15 young people in the countries we work in across at the moment, Africa and Central America. So they were tasked with developing photo essays to show that connection between climate and food systems more broadly, but also the connection between themselves and how they how these issues are affecting young people in Ireland and in Africa and Central America, and kind of essentially from production to consumption. So that was a really effective way of visually depicting the connections there, you know, both on a global issue level and on a personal level. So I encourage you to also check those out as well. I can share links after this in the chat. So yeah, the Connected To campaign was incredibly successful. We found it we had a 1/3 increase in terms of our social media followers across all platforms. And we also doubled our monthly average engagement across all platforms since the launch of that campaign. And also kind of positioned Goal in a global citizenship position with the Irish public, specifically on the issues of climate change and food systems. So it was so successful that we're going to adopt it as an annual campaign, the concept in terms of creating that connection. So this year we're looking at connecting #ConnectedToWater. So we're engaging with the international community again at the UN Ocean Conference in June. And we're looking at profiling our work in Central America in the blue economy. And we're going to use that sense of connection or connected to connect Irish people with the work that we're doing with the communities that are involved with that work and through the youth program as well. So yeah, I think it's just a testament to how effective the research, the Worldview research is in terms of designing that for us. And just, yeah, creating that kind of sense of empathy and relativity rather than the pity and charity sympathy model that I think the whole sector as a whole we're moving away from. And it's really encouraging to see the Worldview research is showing the Irish public are moving away from that as well. So yeah, I suppose I can stop there and just to say that it's yeah, it was great to hear Sally's intervention as well in terms of that more positive news stories or the positive profiling. That's the type of work that we're definitely trying to do and communicate through the Global Citizenship Programme. And maybe, you know, that is a way to kind of, I suppose, counteract that supporter fatigue that Luke has shown is kind of happening post-COVID. So yeah, really exciting to see that. And I suppose as well, just considering, you know, current context and we're seeing a surge of support, you know, following the Ukraine crisis. So how can we harness this sentiment and kind of renewed focus on humanity and humanitarianism that is happening at the moment. So yeah, I'll leave it there, and thanks very much for inviting me.
Great, thanks very much, Vicky. It's great to hear actually some of that, I suppose, application in action, you know, of how you've been able to apply it. And I think perhaps even the example that you've given, you know, in terms of the Connected To project, you know, can overcome some of what we've talked about earlier with Sally, but also came up in the research about how to get around the kind of complexity of some of these messaging without bombarding people with information, you know, and how do you kind of tell the story in a different way that can allow for that kind of nuance or complexity, or not necessarily there's not just one way, you know, or one way that you're telling a story.
Exactly, yeah, we're actually we're in the middle of kind of a brand refresh in terms of our global citizenship work, and our tagline we're looking at or considering is challenging stereotypes and encouraging independent thinking. So it really is just about that, encouraging people to think for themselves and to interrogate and look for the different angles of issues and news stories or communications coming from NGOs or from the sector. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Vicky. So hand over to Joanne, who's also joined us from ActionAid, maybe just to give us a little bit of insight in terms of how you guys are applying some of the research and the data to date. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Jane Ann, and thanks for having me today. So I'm Joanne Ward, and I'm the Communications and Campaigns Manager with ActionAid Ireland. I've been asked to share, I guess, some thoughts on the Worldview research. We've actually just launched a new strategy and kind of are more at the stage of designing how we'll use the research within our new strategy. I'm really happy to talk about a few points. I'm going to talk a little bit about the kind of collaboration that I've seen, a little bit about kind of anti-racism and ethical storytelling, and also about reaching new audiences. So I've been part of the Worldview steering group since I came back from maternity leave in September 2020, and the project had already started, and I was just really impressed with the professionalism and kind of the level of collaboration across all the organizations involved, led by Dóchas. I think actually a really good example of this is the presentation that Vicky has just given from Go Global, just how they use the research with their Connected To campaign. I really liked, she talked about the nudge up strategy. I think that's a really good way of looking at it, and I think there's just a lot for us to learn from that, and I think that's the kind of, you know, shared learning that has been really helpful, and I think is really in the spirit of the project. And it's really, I think, I felt like the NGOs are really trying to improve how we all communicate, widening who we're communicating to together rather than competing against each other, and you know, I think that's really great to see. And also, I think bringing together the diverse skills of those working on the project, it's been really interesting to be involved in, you know, the methodologies developed by BNA and by the Hudsons, but kind of to support public engagement and communication. So all kind of working together, it's been really interesting, and just, yeah, really useful, I think, collaboration for us to date. I think Sally put really well there the importance of nuance in how we're telling stories and talking about different issues, and especially in Africa. And I think it's great to see actually that the Irish Times putting that importance on stories that are just not all negative and not all filtered through NGOs, and also not all centered on white people. I think that's really important and good to see. As I presume everyone here knows, as well as the Worldview research, Dr. Eilish Gillen is working with Dóchas as well on how international development agencies are communicating. I think these two processes are actually really complementary. I know Eilish's paper last year found that, the stereotyped representations used by development organizations have had a really profound negative effect on people of African descent living in Ireland in terms of the racism that they experience. I think this is really devastating finding for anyone working in an NGO in Ireland. And obviously this isn't, this research wasn't developed in isolation. I think obviously the Peace Direct paper, Time to Decolonize Aid, came out last year, and that also showed, structural racism in humanitarian and development sectors. So I think there's really kind of an urgent call in this research to radically improve how we communicate and how we fundraise. And in this light, I think the Worldview research findings that were presented today and that have been coming through are really welcome. In particular, I think the finding, and a few people have mentioned it already, that it's not about pity and sympathy and charity that motivates the people surveyed to support, but rather on human rights, on shared humanity, and on humanitarianism. I think that's really welcome, and it's really great to see. And I think it shows that, there's an ethical imperative, I think, to change how we tell stories, how we fundraise and communicate, but also if the general public are already there to kind of meet us there. So I think that's really great for us to see. And I think that the findings also kind of show maybe where we can improve as well. I think when, asked about the main causes of poverty, and I think, coming up with things like putting the top three, I think were corruption, or government inefficiency. And I think that's a really, big opportunity for us to communicate maybe better on root causes of poverty and kind of where our analysis on that is. So I think that's really useful. And I think Sally pointed out, I think she's one of the only Irish journalists on contract based in Africa. So I think that does put an additional onus on NGOs to ensure that I think the stories that we're telling are ethical and that they're really representative. So then just the last thing I just wanted to say briefly was that I think the audience segmentation itself is just really useful and really will support us, I think, to reach new audiences. And we're kind of looking at how to do that at the moment over the coming years. And I'm kind of guessing, I suppose, making an assumption that as a sector, there's probably a lot of crossover currently in the audiences that we're communicating to. So probably more on the kind of global citizens identified in this research, and maybe a couple of the other already kind of quite engaged audiences that we're probably targeting for, our campaigning and our fundraising work. So I think it's been really good to identify audiences that maybe as a sector we haven't been communicating with as much, and also what motivates these groups in order to expand their engagement. I think Owen put it really well earlier, kind of looking at what motivates them and the blockers and unblockers. I thought that was a really good way of putting it. And I think, for example, the empathetic reactionaries, and they're, nearly 1 million people, make up 26% of the population. And I think that group was maybe largely young women, maybe people with young families. So maybe they don't have the money to donate, or maybe the time to engage in campaigning, but probably could be an audience that we say really proud of, like the work that Irish Aid fund on their behalf. So I think it's really helpful to kind of identify these audiences and be able to tailor make content that I guess will speak specifically to them. I think that's been a really useful finding within the research. So yeah, we're just looking forward to, I guess, over the coming months and years, working with the wider group and, developing resources, sharing our own learnings and kind of continuing to work together, and also hopefully really, improving how we communicate and, developing really anti-racist ethical communications and fundraising.
Thanks, thanks very much for that, Joanne, and indeed also to you, Vicky, for those reflections. I think it really adds to, like, there's a lot to digest, I think, in terms of what we've heard this afternoon. So it's great to hear your thoughts on that. And I think, you know, I just want to add, and feel free if there are any particular questions that anybody wants to raise at this stage, you know, and do put up your hand and I can go to before we close. But a couple of reflections just from my side. I think that, as you mentioned, there's a significant group in the middle, and it's really around drilling down a bit more into that data, into the segmentation, into how you can target those with the kind of tailored messaging, indeed, to see how we can bring them along, I suppose, with us. And that perhaps, as Owen mentioned, you know, there might be those, you know, I can't remember exactly how they're called, but, you know, the resistors, or there's a group that perhaps, you know, we have to acknowledge as a sector that we may never reach, but there's a significant group in the middle of 70% that, you know, we can have an adaptive approach to and see how we can engage with in a better way. I think one thing I would just like to mention is, like, I do think that there is a challenge, I think, for a lot of our members now, you know, on, you know, trying to convey the reality of what we're seeing on the ground, the reality of the context in which we work, the reality now in terms of how we want to even work in a slightly different way, or are working in a different way in terms of locally led development, and how we can convey some of those more complex messages and to a wider audience. And I think that it's interesting, and one of the things I picked up probably from Sally, and she's not here to mention it, but, you know, is that perhaps it's also about how journalists perceive us as a sector, and that, you know, there was, you know, that she referred to, you know, the kind of the NGOs trying to get their piece across, trying to make sure that their branding is mentioned, and perhaps kind of missing some of the, you know, trying to support kind of the journalists in terms of trying to identify what the key problems are, or to give a broader perspective on the situation on the ground, rather than for their own gain. And whether that's true or not, there is probably a perception there amongst journalists, or indeed editors as well, that might be the case. So I think that's something that we should kind of take on board or ponder, and just think how we actually engage both with journalists and the media in terms of telling some of those stories. And I think, you know, what it comes down to, and I think what Sally kind of referred to again and again, is the power a bit of that kind of personal testimonies, of ensuring kind of, you know, trying to listen to what kind of the Irish public want to hear, but also kind of marrying that with the reality on the ground, and seeing how you can make that probably the most powerful impact that you can get is from those individuals within the communities that you're working with, or the individuals affected. And trying to see how we can kind of bring that to the fore, while at the same time not creating too many kind of individualistic kind of stories that are kind of focused on with the kind of a pity lens, I think, as Vicky mentioned. So before we wrap up, I'm not sure if there's any other questions or comments, but I'd like to thank you all for your time today. I'd like to mention, and particularly to Niamh, to organising all of this, as many of you know. Niamh is our key person when it comes to the Worldview programme. I would like to go to Paula. Would you like to say a few words before you wrap up?
Sorry, Janelle, I didn't mean to interrupt your wrap up there. That was my slowness in being able to find the raise hand function. Firstly, I just want to say thanks very much to Dóchas and all the presenters. It's just been such an interesting afternoon of presentations, and I think covered so many different angles. My brain was kind of flitting between all of them, between, you know, how the journalists would take it and how the NGOs would use it. I just had a fairly, I hope, straightforward question for Vicky. I was really interested in the approach she said about the nudging up and looking at the segments and seeing if you could move people from, you know, one segment to a more engaged segment. I was just interested if Vicky could say anything about how they measured that, or, you know, were they able to measure that, whether that movement was actually successful, and how they went about that.
Yeah, hi, Paula, good to see you, and thanks for the question. Yeah, that was a nudge of strategy that was developed for the campaign with, I think, yeah, Dóchas would know them well, We the People, a communications consultants that worked with us on that strategy. So they measured it very much digitally through, targeted, algorithms in terms of people, different demographics on social media. So we are waiting for a full report on that, and would love to share that with you and with Dóchas. You can add it to the toolkit there that is that I shared in the chat. But yeah, it was very much done through digital analysis of various demographics in terms of what was liked and shared. And then there was also the engagement matrix as well. I think we had looked at that. That was similar to what the UK campaign used as well, in terms of that metric system of engagement, rather than I suppose vanity metrics of liking and sharing. So yeah, very happy to share all of that with you, and I think Niamh can upload it to the toolkit as well for the rest of the people on the call.
Great, thanks, Vicky. No, I just think that will be obviously the challenging bit for all of us, is translating, moving from worldview, which captures attitudes at the population level, down to tracking results on our own individual communications as organizations, and obviously collectively in campaigns. And any learning there is on that, I suppose, that can go under the worldview information, I suppose, would be really useful, I think, for the sector. So thank you.
Great. And on that note as well, just to remind everybody here on the call, or indeed for your colleagues, that there is the Worldview Toolkit, which is available on our website, and you'll find lots of, I suppose we only gave some of the highlights of the data here today, so you can get the full report and a lot of the details there on our website as well, and that'll be kept up to date. And Niamh, I think it's just put in the link there, so all the resources are very much housed there, so and are very much available to our members as well to engage with, and to link in with Niamh on for any additional information that you would like. So I'd just like to thank all our contributors today, particularly for Luke, Jennifer, David, obviously Sally who's gone, but also Vikki and Joanne as well for joining us today, for making it quite a rich session as well. Lots to think about, but indeed lots of ways that we can kind of move forward in terms of implementing, and tracking developing taking on some of the insights from the data and moving it forward. So thank you very much.